Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to give us a few more seconds to make sure that we get everyone on. See, the number is still going up a little bit. Okay. We will continue on. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on approaches to assessing the economic impact of research to farmers. As we've had some conversations with researchers and with farmers in the past, one of the dominant themes that arise when talking to producers is why they do or don't adopt certain practices. And one of the things that pops up regularly is around the return on investment and really wondering what's going on there. And so we have this webinar as a way to address that a little bit and provide you with some tools. And we're placing an increased emphasis on economic analysis embedded within your research projects. So the webinar today is intended to provide you with an overview of economic analysis approaches and tools that can help you think through how your project can add value to a farm operation. And it's our hope that the content is useful in development of your full proposals and as well when assessing the value of new research findings in a way that will resonate with grain producers. Before we begin the webinar, I want to give you an overview of the interface you see in front of you so you understand how we're going to handle it today. So today's webinar will be recorded and it will be available for viewing later as well. If you happen to be on a browser that is not Chrome, Firefox, or Opera, you may find there's a slight lag from real time as you watch the webinar. And then I'd like you to take a look at the interface in front of you and you'll notice a few headers on the right side of your screen. There's a chat, a questions header, and a polls header. And the chat box is where you are free to submit questions at any time during the webinar, and we will pull from those during the question and answer period that will follow John's presentation. The question box we will not be using during the webinar, so we're only working off the chat box. And then there is also a polls section. And so I'd like us all to actually start off today by going over to the polls section. And we will start off with a quick poll. I'm just going to publish that here. So the question is, on a scale of 1 to 5, how comfortable are you with economic analyses in your research area? Okay, we're starting to level out here. So we got a good mix. We got a bit of a bell curve around 3. So that's good to be aware of as we go into today. Okay, I am going to pull that poll down now. Thank you very much for your feedback on that. And then I'd like to introduce to you our speaker for today. John Molenhuis is the Business Analysis and Cost of Production Program Lead at OMAFRA. And he's spent a lot of time working in this area of economic analysis. And so we're really excited to have him give a bit of an overview of this field. And I'm going to step off stage, ask John to come on up and begin. And I'll see you again at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Josh, and good afternoon, and thank you to the grain farmers for giving me this opportunity, and thanks to you that have joined the session, and hopefully you find it useful. And again, yeah, this virtual platform, I'm sure all of us are getting used to it, and those of you that are in teaching positions, I'm sure you're fully immersed into it by now. So there's all kinds of different applications and platforms that we've used. I'm sure we've all been on Zoom and Adobe Connect and Teams and now live stream as well. This is the first time for me as well. So again, thank you for joining, and we'll proceed here talking about like economic analysis, economic impact, cost benefit analysis, those terms are all sort of used interchangeably on when we're looking at sort of trying to determine the economics of different research and projects. So not necessarily in this linear point-by-point fashion, but we will be covering by the end of this, we'll touch on some of the data needs, a few of the different methods that I'm going to present on, trying to map out a few of the examples, and then also point to some of the resources and data sources that are available that can give you a bit of a hand in putting some of the dollar signs to some of the production figures that you have. So we'll have that covered in today's session. So starting off here, data collection needs. Of course, you'll need a baseline, and you need that in any research project that you're working on. Of course, trying to measure the impact of a change, be it a new production practice or adopting a new technology or adding new equipment to your operation. All of those research will need to have a baseline. And one of the main things that I want to highlight here is, in many of the research projects that I've been involved in, looking at sort of the economics of these things, much of the data is already there. You're collecting a lot of the production data, seeding rates, fertilizer, pesticide rates, monitoring, measuring yields, and any production practice changes are documented. So all of that is already there. It's just a matter of then putting a dollar sign to it, which I know, sometimes, that's easy to say, but I don't know that you need to overcomplicate it, and I wouldn't think you would want to overcomplicate it. So a lot of that production information is going to be there, and then it's just a matter of putting those dollar figures to it. Many times, especially if you're looking at machinery investment, the additional information you need is things on prices. So prices you may be able to get from the farms or from equipment dealers, depending on the type of research you're doing. And then it's a matter of then coming up with per acre costs on those machinery. So that's a bit of a task, and we'll talk a bit about that today. And then, of course, when you're looking at different production practices, different seeding or different rates for fertilizer or pesticides or different products, those will, just looking for input prices to apply to those production factors that you will have already recorded. So it's just a matter of putting that dollar to it. So again, it's not something that we want to overcomplicate, and just highlight that much of the information, I find anyway, is already there, and there just may be a few additional pieces that you may need to think about to add that economic analysis piece to it. So today I'm going to cover four of some of the main methods that, common measures that people use in the economic analysis, and cost benefit analysis is going to be the sort of the main title I'll be using, I guess, throughout this on that. And we'll be working in sort of a clockwise direction through these. So we're starting off with contribution margin, and as we work through them, each of them is adding a little bit more complexity to it, until you get to the return on investment side of things, which just requires a little bit more data and a little bit more involvement on that side of things. And they all take a slightly different lens to the analysis. So depending on the research you're doing and depending on sort of the focus, one may be a little bit more appropriate than the other. So you can sort of pick and choose. It's not that every one of these has to be used. It's just a matter of sort of figuring out what one is the best fit for the research question you have and the type of data that we're looking for. And these are common terms as well that are familiar within the farm sector. I mean, return on investment is one that's talked about an awful lot. Payback periods is another big one. And margins is another one that are common terms that are out there. So these are sort of some of the more common measures that we'll talk about and discuss today. So the first one here, contribution margin, it's revenue minus variable costs, and again, it's a typical one, and gross margin and contribution margin tend to be sort of interchangeable as far as like people use them interchangeably, but I do want to sort of make the distinction between the two of them. The gross margin, for my definition, sort of technically is this, revenue minus the direct costs. So this is the seed, the fertilizer, and the pest margin. So this is the gross margin, and this just sort of demonstrates that, writing with a mouse is just challenging. It's not exactly the greatest penmanship, but this is the gross margin. Then the contribution margin then factors in sort of these indirect costs that maybe not directly attributable to a crop like seed is to corn. Fuel, you'll have to do some kind of an allocation scheme to get fuel on a corn level or a soybean level, depending on the research that you're having. But these are the variable costs that do vary with the level of production, and that comes up with the contribution margin. So that's the distinction, and yeah, I don't want to belabor that, but that is sort of the distinction there. Some people use them interchangeably. It is just important when you're using it to define it so that people know exactly, because there are some differences in the definitions. As well, if you're looking at different reports that use them, just understanding what they're including in that is important so that you can understand sort of what things are included in it. It is commonly used for agronomic practice changes that sort of have a 1-year lifetime, right? It's, you're increasing seeding rates or decreasing seeding rates that have an impact on the yields this year and don't have any carryover year over year. So there's not a multi-year kind of benefits or accruing benefits over time. It's typically a 1 year and done increase of fertilizer rates. What happens with the yields, and it doesn't typically, it doesn't factor in new capital investment. So it's not really looking at new capital investment because the contribution margin doesn't include all of the costs that are associated with that new capital investment. So it is really just sort of for agronomic changes, more production related changes as opposed to new capital investment changes. And some of the income and expenses, then of course you would need access to the income and expenses for filling in these. And some of the challenges on the contribution margin piece is, especially if you're looking at, things like utilities or professional fees or office expenses, you may find from the baseline to the change resulting from the research, there's no change in them. There may be costs in here that you've done the work of doing the allocation and coming up and collecting that data, and there even may be no change in those. So it then becomes a question of why are we doing that? And especially if you're working with farm cooperators and collecting that data, they'll be like, why are you collecting this? It's not going to impact the change, right? So there is that question. And there's also the challenge of allocating it. If you're doing just corn research, allocating these kind of indirect costs can be a challenge to corn, to allocate it to the individual crops. And if in the end it doesn't really change, then you wonder, well, why are we including those? And it's a valid question on those, and typically why we then go to the next the measure, the partial budgets, because then it does isolate what are the changes that are going to take place in the new practice and technology on the equipment, or adding new technology or adding new equipment. It then just isolates those and only looks at those things that are going to change. So it's not trying to collect information that's not going to have an impact either way. The things that don't change aren't going to have that impact on the end result. And yeah, it is just looking at, increase, or on the revenue side of things, you're looking at, okay, is there increases or decreases in yield, increases or decreases in quality that are going to, feed into that cost benefit, and decrease costs or increase costs if you're looking at different, fertilizer rates or seeding rates or those types of things, or adding new equipment, what are those increased costs, and just isolating those, not trying to collect more data than you really need to. It is a very simple setup, and it's very effective actually. So it's used in a lot of different situations to try to map out, and it's just mapping out that change. You can sometimes you'll see it applied, people trying to do a whole farm analysis on these. This can fit into that as well. It just means, this is going to be the net impact of this decision, and then you can apply it to the whole farm, as opposed to trying to collect all of that whole farm data to begin with. That's a challenge, and a lot of that won't apply to the research that you're looking at, won't impact it. So it can be kind of a data burden that's not necessary. And just the last point on this one that I'd point out here is on the benefits and cost side of things, that annual net benefit. If you're looking at a multi-year project, say you're looking at something like soil health that's going to have long-term benefits that accrue over a length of time, or investments that last more than a year. It's not just fertilizer that applies to this year and doesn't carry over. It's looking at some of those longer-term impacts, longer-term costs. You want to make sure in this analysis that you're looking at it on, in present value dollars, so that you're making sure that it's adjusting or deflating or indexing that number back to the present value. I don't want to get too much into the nitty gritty on the net present value, just to say in those multi-year analysis, you want to make sure that when you're looking at that net benefit, it's looking at it all in common dollars, just to highlight that piece of it. So you're be mindful of that when you're looking at it on these multi-year projects. So with both the contribution margin and the partial budget, you then start, okay, well, now where do I start looking for some of that data? If it is, you're using on-farm, if you're doing farm trials, on-farm trials, and you may be able to do some of that data collection, you may find some resistance on the income and expense side of things. Farmers tend to be more receptive to talking yields and production factors, seeding rates, pesticide application, products used, and those types of things, but less comfortable divulging the income and expense information. So you may find some challenges in that data collection if you're trying to go that route. So we do have some cost of production information within OMAFRA. We have the field crop budgets, which is an annual publication that I work with the field crop team to put together each year. We also have these, like the current one is on the website. If you're looking for historical information, I have back as far as 1976, actually, versions of the Pub 60, if you're so inclined, on some of those to look for historical information. We also have them in Excel format, so you can, which is useful when you're trying to do some of those changes that you're looking at on the research side of things, to have it in Excel format to do some of those changes, see what some of those impacts are. So we've got 20, 30 plus field crop budgets that are available online for you to access in Excel format to work through some of those if you're looking for a tool. Ridgetown College has input price survey that they've been doing for many years, and they survey 3 to 4 times a year for the main direct inputs for field crops. So we've got fuel, fertilizer, pesticide, and seed are the 4 main areas. It's a selection of those, so it's not an exhaustive list, but it is sort of a beginning source where you can have a look at and see whether the products you're using or the fertilizer you're using are listed in there. So you've got a current price on those to apply. If you do find that you don't have those prices, then you may need to go to input suppliers, and you may have those prices already because you've got to, through your research, purchase the seed or purchase the fertilizer for the research purposes. So you may have those prices already, but if not, the input suppliers, then you can start tapping on some of those shoulders. Some may be resistant, but and that's fine if they don't want to give that kind of information, but then you just move on. There's many suppliers out there that are receptive to research projects and realize that data is needed, so they're receptive to providing input prices as long as anonymity is assured and that their market information isn't, their proprietary information isn't divulged. They're fairly good about sharing that information, or can be. And then on the prices and yields, more on the benefits side of things, we do have field crop statistics with historical prices and yields on our website at OMAFRA, and then Grain Farmers has their farm market prices that the daily current prices are put out, and then they've also got a section there that have historical commodity prices that you can then start applying those costs to the various aspects of your research. So then I just wanted to kind of show a bit of an example of using the partial budget, just a very simple, spray or not to spray decision, and some of the things to think about on this. So if you look on the left, this is just sort of the simple framework of, on the benefit side, what are some of the benefits we think? Increased yield, possibly not in this scenario. That spray or not to spray is typically looking at protection against yield loss. So we've got on on the benefit side, and then on the cost side, of course, if we're looking to do an additional spray, there's the machinery costs, application costs, and the product costs there as well. So on the right side then maps out a little bit more of that in detail. So I've just assumed a 5% loss for this example on 180 bushel crop. That's 9 bushels. Got the grain market prices from the Grain Farmers of Ontario information, so 475. So the benefit was 42.75 against, on the cost side of things, I use the custom rates, and we do have custom rates for the NOMAFRA that you can use on the machinery cost side of things, and then using the pesticide prices from Bridgetown to come up with that cost of $35. You see the net benefit of 775. So we've got a positive there. So then by this, it makes economic sense to do the spray because you're looking at a positive net benefit. In your situation, you may be looking at, that yield loss protection may be part of your research question. You're trying to find out what that number is or what kind of thresholds are we looking at. So you can look at it the other way as well, using the $35 cost and the market price. You would need to have a loss of 7.4 bushels or more for it to make economic sense to start thinking about that spray application. So a 4% loss or more in this situation for it to start making economic sense to do that spray. One of the big factors in this, of course, is that market price. That's the one that in this whole scenario probably fluctuates the most and has the most variability. So I just for an example, had a look at sort of the average annual cost or prices for the last 10 years, a low of 415 and a high of 660. And even within year, you're going to have even more variable than that. These are the average annual prices. So you see on the low side, the net benefit is 235. So it's getting close to break even at that 415, but at 660, you got a net benefit of 24. So this is just to highlight the fact that market prices are going to have a big determining factor, and it's something that you want to be mindful of when you're looking at, yield protection and it, the incentive to protect yields at high market prices is certainly a higher incentive than when it's lower prices, because that threshold then just becomes a little bit more attractive on the high side than on the low side. It's just something to keep mindful of, because that's a key factor, a key assumption in there is that price they're going to receive, and trying to determine what some of those yield thresholds are. So that's just one example of how to use the partial budget, and it's fairly simple again, but it is fairly effective. So just take a minute here just to sort of address sort of the data challenges. The short-term cost, or the cost side of things, actually tends to be almost the easier area to calculate or measure. It's when you get into the benefit side of things, and a lot of that comes out of the research that you folks are doing, and out of the research that trying to determine what those benefits are, especially when you're looking at long-term benefits. If you're looking at soil health, I know I've been involved in a couple of different projects on the soil health, cover crops, and some other areas that are looking at, what's the economic impact of increasing soil organic matter, or reducing compaction, and how do you put numbers on that, and it becomes a bit more of a challenge on the benefit side of things, I find, where the cost is, this is my pesticide costs, these are my seed costs, these are my machine costs. Those things you can calculate, might chase down a little bit of the numbers on it, but not out of the way. Challenges to calculate those. The benefit side of things tends to be where some of the more challenging areas lie. Just to highlight that point, as far as using cover crops as an example, you see here on the cost side of things, the main cost for cover crops is in this planting termination, the seeding of the cover crop, and then terminating at the end of it before planting of the subsequent crop. Grazing may be a factor if you've got livestock involved. If it's, if they're looking at livestock or grazing as part of that research, then that may be involved. And then you get down here, it gets a little bit more difficult, perhaps, like learning curve. I've seen some learning curve is that, some yield lags, right? So they're trying to do some things on cover crops and they don't quite get it. So they've got some yield issues maybe early on, and it may actually show itself in harvest complications as far as maybe dockages because there's weed seeds in it, or having to slow the combine down, or that type of thing. So those factors can come into play, but that becomes on the cost side of things. These ones, yeah, it takes a little bit of work to get them, but the numbers tend to be out there where you look at some of the, these here, the long-term benefits. It can be a challenge. Like what is those benefits? What is the economic benefit of increased organic matter or increased microbial activity? Those areas are difficult, and I know there's quite a bit of research going on in that area, just because, well, especially in soil health, there's a lot of research going in on those types of things that I would certainly encourage you folks to have a look at, doing those literature reviews and seeing what other folks are doing to try to put numbers to these, because I know those can be challenges. The shorter term benefits can be a little bit easier, reduced tillage, again, it's machinery costs and yields, those can be mapped out, and weed control is, again, either product costs or application costs. Those kind of things can be, a little bit easier mapped out. These longer term benefits can be a challenge, and finding other folks that have done some research on that and seeing what their approaches are can be a benefit and give you some ideas of how to approach those. And that's why I included this this example in here. I just pulled this off of a USDA site. It's looking at, again, a multi-year study. 1, 3, and 5 years are posted here, but it's, again, using that parcel budget format. So these first here would be the benefits section, just looking at, benefits in fertilizer, weed control, or erosion control. And here is the cost of seeding. So this is both the planting and the termination is what they included in those lines. So again, sort of that partial budget, only look at what changes and factor those in, or only consider those. This then just gives you an example of, here's a laundry list of things that could be impacting the cover crops. And if you go to this study, you'll see all of these are footnoted, and they do a fairly good job of telling you, how they calculated some of these things and the approaches they take to put some numbers to these things. Like compaction can be how do you calculate compaction? Well, this number here, the 1530, was simply they didn't have to do a subsoiling. So they said, okay, well, that's, I'm not going to, this is the custom rate for subsoiling. So they said, okay, well, we don't have to do the subsoiling because we don't have compaction problems because of the cover crop. So it could be those. Same thing with these. This is the machinery costs for reducing from conventional to no-till, those types of things. These ones can be a little more difficult. Then again, like this is getting a little bit more into the resilience of crops because of cover crops, extra yield in a drought year. So in the brackets here, they again kind of highlighted some of the data sources that they're using. So they've surveyed growers, and they've, this is the bump in yield and bump in income that they received because, in a dry year, the moisture stuck around, and they were able to capture that and weren't affected as much by the drought as others. So there's different factors here that they're considering, and it gives you kind of a good little bit of an overview, or gives you some ideas of the types of things that you can be thinking about here. Erosion repair is another one that in this one, they just calculated labor to fix erosion problems, as far as, getting out there and filling in the gullies and those kind of things. I've seen studies as well where they put a value on the soil that's left the farm. So they come up with sort of a formula to calculate what the value of that soil is, and calculate how much cubic feet of soil have left the more involved. But again, it's just sort of one of those approaches that they've used on that. So this was just kind of an example of sort of the stepwise approach that some of these folks have taken to put numbers to things that are difficult to put numbers to. So just to give you some ideas on that side of things. So that's the partial budget approach. And you see here, I'll just look at the normal year again as an example. You see here the net benefit of $1.42. Well, it shows you how that makes sense to start doing it, even more so at $17.90. One of the other questions that commonly comes around is how long is it going to take me to pay off, especially maybe not so much in the cover crop example, but in investing in capital equipment. The question becomes, how long is it going to take me to pay off that piece of equipment based on, the benefit that I'm having? Does it make economic sense for me to invest in that? Are the benefits high enough? So then you need to start looking at something beyond the partial budget to answer that question. So that's why you look at the payback period. So here you're including that partial budget information that you've gathered through that process. So this feeds into the payback period, the partial budget information, and then looks at what is that investment cost. So this is typically used when assessing capital investment mostly, right? You're looking at how many years is it going to take me to pay off this piece of equipment that I'm buying, and how many years am I going to, you may have a targeted number of years that you want this to pay off on that side of things. So calculating those numbers can be a bit of a challenge. So I thought, well, we do have some resources here to help you put together some of the cost information. We have custom rates at OMAF. Every 3 years we survey for custom rates, so those are available. 2018 is the latest information we have on those. We also have a fact sheet and a calculator for calculating machinery costs. So if there's individual equipment that isn't included in some of the custom rates, you might be able to then do some calculations and putting getting the variable and fixed cost included into the costs of the research, applying that, so it can help you do that. The machinery purchase prices, it may be, if you're working with on-farm cooperators, they may just say, yeah, this piece of equipment cost me $30,000 or $300,000, whatever the case may be. Or you can be talking with equipment dealers. Even some of the dealerships have build and price apps online that you can have a look and do some pricing on to get a general sense of what that piece of equipment is, to get that purchase price that you can then feed into the machinery cost calculator to calculate the individual variable and fixed costs for that piece of equipment. So I thought just sort of demonstrate that. This is a horticulture example. It's a project I was involved with on studying apple platforms for labor productivity. So it was trying to answer the question, when does it make economic sense to start looking at an apple platform replacing manual labor going up and down ladders? So this is what the project was looking at. So we had, this $60,000 platform that was replacing, you can get ladders for, $200, $300, right? So it was, fairly significant increase in the investment. So they wanted to make sure it was going to pay off. So had to go through the process of calculating the machinery costs. So with the fuel, talking with the growers, we get the estimates of how much they've used it and what the fuel was, the fuel use on it. But then the rest of it, we were able to then use the machinery cost fact sheet and the calculators to calculate estimates on these, because if it's not a piece of equipment they've got on a farm, they don't have necessarily those costs in there. So you've got to come up with some estimates, and the machinery cost fact sheet can help on that. So in our study, came out that it was going to be on our 60-acre typical orchard, 171 acres per $171 per acre, this additional cost of this additional piece of equipment on farm. So that then gets fed into the partial budget. You see that on the bottom. Can I hide that? Oh, look at that. Apologize. I thought it was hide. I thought it was going to hide from my view, but okay. That'll take it out a little bit. Hopefully it's not in your way now. So you see that $171 now gets included in the cost side of things. And then in this study, we were looking at the benefits. Obviously, didn't find a lot of difference in the fruit quality. We did look at that, and that may be one of the things as well. You think, well, there might be some differences in these areas, but you may find there isn't significant differences on there. So you may be collecting information that in the end doesn't change, but at least it gives you this, be able to answer, well, we didn't find a significant difference on that, answering questions on it. This was mainly a labor savings. So you see significant labor savings depending on the field operation that they're looking at. And so the net benefit at the bottom, $18 to $605 benefit, annual net benefit. So, certainly some strong net benefits, but again, it comes to the question of, well, what's enough, right? Like what level of net benefit is enough to make sense for me to, it's not just that it's positive, it has to, because it's a new piece of equipment, we're buying this for $60,000, we need to know when it's going to pay off. And so in this situation, actually, the hand thinning and pruning elements were done by everybody, and harvest was not incorporated, didn't use the platforms for all. So when I go to the next slide here, the benefit, the 24,000, 36,000 factors that in. It's either with or without harvest in that. So with this, then you look at it's, on the 60,000 purchase price, it's going to take 1.7 to 2.5 years to pay back that Apple platform. So fairly attractive payback period on the Apple platform. So that's one area you want to make sure you're looking at, because if the scenario was different, if we came in here and we said it takes 17 years to pay back, well, are you even going to have that Apple platform there after 17 years? And is it even worth still having it there, or is it going to be obsolete and the repair costs too much? So that's why I think a lot of producers have a number in mind, or at least a target area of it should be at least the life of the asset for sure, right? I mean, if it's only going to be a 10-year asset, then you don't want this any longer than 10 years for sure, but certainly less than that is preferred. Electronics is one big area that it's really tight, as far as you want a really tight time frame on the payback period, because of the ag sector, the amount of the ag sector here, we've got the dirt and the dust involved. Electronics just doesn't last long, so it needs to be paid off in 2 to 3 years, or it's just not worth it, because that electronics won't be worth anything anymore after. If it's going to take 5 or 6 years, that electronics maybe have already been replaced. So another big factor in here is the number of acres. So when we use 60 acres in our study, if we pushed it to 40 acres, that stretched the payback to 7 years. And when you get to 20 acres, there was no payback, just because they couldn't use it enough to pay back the fixed costs and the operating costs of that platform. So acres is a key factor. So what I thought I'd just demonstrate here is just to give you that will be a situation with the Ontario grain farms as well. So this gives you a sense of what, out of the 2016 census, what kind of grain farm sizes are out there. So 80% of the farms reporting were less than 360 acres. 720 or more were 10% of the. So it's important to keep that in mind. Adopting some of this new equipment, new technologies may make sense for some, but it may not be for all if they're just small, not large enough to be able to stretch those fixed costs and have a payback period. So it's something to keep in mind. So then one of the challenges or caveats with the payback period is it only looks at the point at which it pays back. It doesn't consider the life of the asset. It's in the Apple platform example here, the 2.5 years. It's not looking beyond 2.5 years. It says, okay, I've paid it off in 2.5 years. I'm not looking any further in this method, the payback period. The return on investment considers the life of the asset, or the life of the benefits that accrue over time. So it is then a little better at capturing the return on investment beyond just the payback period. So it's considering the life of that asset, and it's commonly used for capital investment, but it also is, like I'm sure you've heard of, maybe input suppliers or folks that talk about return on investment in fertilizer, or return on investment in soil testing. So you can use it for agronomic changes or input changes. And in the fertilizer example, it would be the cost of the fertilizer, and the net benefit would be the bump in yield that you get. And so you can calculate those on an agronomic basis as well. You will notice that there's certainly a relationship between the payback period and the ROI. It's just simply the reverse of the two. So if you look at a 2-year payback period, that translates into a 50% return on investment. A 5-year payback period is a 20% return on investment. There is a slight difference in that the payback period, again, only looks up until the point that you're paid back. So the annual benefit will only be looking at the benefit up to the year of payback, where the net benefit and the return on investment is looking at the net benefits that accrue over the lifetime of the asset on the farm. So that's one thing to keep in mind, but it is kind of a handy, quick and dirty way of sort of calculating the two different factors there. So those are some of the things to think about on the return on investment side of things on that scale. So then, yeah, just going back to our earlier examples, what was the return on investment to the spray application? Well, with that $35 cost that we had and the benefit translated into a 20% return on investment, where in the Apple platform, it turned, that benefit was a 40 to 60% return on investment. So you can have fairly fantastic return on investment claims. I've seen quite a bit in the sort of the precision ag area. I see quite a bit of it, sort of, 100, 200% return on investment. And it could be, but you do need to be mindful of what they're including in it, because I know sometimes they say it's a return on investment is more looking at the return on investment on the fertilizer you may have, the relationship between the variable rate fertilizer and the yield increase, but doesn't factor in the machine costs of that precision ag equipment. So just be mindful of those kind of things when you're looking at some of those numbers, just to make sure what's included in it, just so you can better understand and better interpret what those are. Those are just some examples. Yep, you can use return on investment on agronomic practices, or it's more commonly used on more longer term investments from that standpoint. So just in summary here, again, you're going to need that baseline, and you'll need that for your research anyways, but coming up with some of those estimates on farm, much of that will be collected, like much of the data, the production data will be collected, and it'd just be a matter of maybe collecting some of the input price data, potentially some of the machinery price data, if you need that from the farms, if not, going out and finding some other sources. And I did give point to some of the different sources within OMAFRA and elsewhere that you could access potentially to get some of that information. And then again, depending on the aim of or the scope of your research project and the types of things you're looking at, the types of changes you're looking at, and the research questions you're trying to answer, which one of the methods are you using, the contribution margin or partial budgets or payback and return on investment? You can choose. It's not that you have to do all of them, but partial budget certainly feeds into the other two, the paybacks and return on investment, which the last two tend to be looking at longer term investments. Can be in the case of return on investment on fertilizer, you can use it for agronomic, but tends to be for the longer term investments. And there's no real getting away from it. Long-term benefits are a challenge. It is a challenge, and that's a lot of what the research now is trying to get at. It's something, soil health is a big one that I've seen quite a bit of, trying to get what are those numbers, what does increased soil organic matter mean, and try to translate that into yield that you can then translate into a dollar number. It's a challenge, and there are some resources, and I would encourage sort of looking at what other folks have done to try to come up with ways of putting number to those. But that's sort of the biggest challenge, is those long-term benefits. And sort of my final comment is that there is help available. There are, we have OMAFRA staff, and myself included, that would be able to give some insights or be involved in helping in some of that economic analysis if you need it. Within your universities, if you're part of the University of Guelph, for example, there's the FAIR department that you can lean on some of their expertise and some of their insights of how to come up with some of that economic analysis piece. But certainly there's resources out there and data sources out there that can help you put some of those numbers to the production factors that you're looking at. So with that is all I have, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen just so then I can see questions and get back to the session.
Thank you very much, John, for sharing this with us and demystifying some of the economic analysis approaches. I see in our chat box and also in questions, there's a few really good questions for us to run through here. So I'm going to start with the first one. This comes in regard to the partial budget. So thanks for this great example on the partial budget. Since market price for grain varies, would you tend to give a range of benefits, like $28 to $45, depending on grain price, rather than select a single average grain price?
Yeah, can you hear me? I seem to have frozen. Okay, yep. I'm frozen on screen and you're frozen on screen. But yeah, no, for sure. Like that would make sense to do that, because the variability on the grain price is like there is significant volatility in that. So it does make sense to look at ranges as opposed to that average grain price. You know, like you say, there's the range that comes into that, right? So there's significant up and down range on that. So I think yeah, that would make sense.
Great. And I think sometimes being able to tie it to what price you used in your analysis really helps too, because it helps somebody gauge relative to what their price currently is. Next question here is around payback period. So the payback period is affected in direct inverse proportion to the acreage the machinery is used on. So how do you know how many acres to assume? Or maybe it's a range again. What would you do when you're looking at a payback period and farm size?
Yeah, no, excellent point. That is very true, because yeah, the acreage will spread those fixed costs across more. That's the key thing with machinery, is you use it across more acres so that you can spread those fixed costs on there. And it can be, I know in some of the things, like in the example for the apples, we use 60 acres because that was kind of what we were working with the apple growers at the time. We said, okay, what's sort of a typical size apple orchard? But then at the same point, we worked some of the numbers on a typical size, but we did have those ranges in there too, that we said, we did have the tables that demonstrated, well, at 40 acres, you're pushing it out, and at 20 acres, it doesn't make sense. Those kind of things. But yeah, you're right. Knowing how many acres to assume is difficult. Trying to come up with sort of a typical grain farm size can be a challenge too, because you're looking at, you saw the one example there or the one graph that shows that 80% are less than 360. Well, if you're less than 360, that there's a lot of equipment that just doesn't pencil out for less than 360. So are you going to do an Ontario average, or are you going to look at what's a commercial size grain farm that could realistically look at incorporating that kind of equipment? But yeah, I mean, it's a good point. There's no hard and fast way to do that, but yeah, for sure, acres is going to have a big impact.
Just to expand on that question a little bit, when you're looking at a new piece of equipment, what would be maybe a standard or best range to use in terms of the lifespan of that piece? So you talked about electronics being pretty short-lived currently, but when you look at kind of your standard equipment, is it 5 years, 10 years, or what would be a good starting point in terms of thinking about how long it'd be around on the farm?
Yeah, and actually we did do a bit of a take on that in the machinery cost fact sheet. We actually just updated that this year, and one of the tables in there, and I don't have all the numbers in front of me, that does give what they deem sort of an economic life, or an optimal life, I guess, which was when it got to 30% of the value of the salvage value. So it ranges, like tractors will have a shorter lifespan than, say, a plow, and tillage equipment will have a longer lifespan, but it does vary depending on the type of equipment. But as a guide, you can have a look at the machinery cost fact sheet that has some selected pieces of equipment that can give you a bit of a sense of what kind of lifespan to estimate.
Thanks. One of the comments that's coming as well around this concept is, should we also incorporate acres within the return on investment? Like this new tech gives a 50% return on investment with 500 acres. So there's kind of a point that give somebody a frame of reference in terms of where it starts to pay off. You know, if you want a short.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, because that return on investment. Yeah, if you want to lay out the assumptions that you have on that number so that they can kind of judge for themselves if I'm larger than that or smaller than that, what that might do for me.
Sounds good. We're going to switch over into weeds now. Yield loss due to weed interference varies dramatically from year to year and field to field. In 2020, the comment is that they're conducting trials on 6 farms in southwestern Ontario with multiple herbicide-resistant water hemp. So this researcher is confident corn yield loss will vary from 0 to 100%. The long-term average corn yield loss is around 17%, which is what they would think would be the appropriate number to use. Is that the right way to do it, or is there a way to capture that variability better?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure I have the perfect answer for that. I mean, sort of a long-term average, I think, would be probably a better route to go, just because you can have that year-to-year variability. But sort of you could have in the comments or those kind of things that yield losses have seen those types of ranges like 0 to 100%. But like I said, some of these long term, and that's unfortunate with some of these. Some of this research it takes a long time to know what some of these things are, unless somebody's already done the work and you can pull off a 10-year study that shows some of that variability may, if you've only done 1 year study, that variability shows up. It's tough to know what the right number to use is because you've seen so much variability. But if you've got, I would say you get a little more confidence in the longer term average would be.
So what I'm seeing with a lot of these is ranges, whether it's acres or it's number of years payback or it's, yield loss over a range of scenarios, is presenting economics in terms of a range, trying to give the reader an understanding of that. Would that be accurate in terms of making sure that range is part of the discussion when economics?
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, I think we're seeing that in a lot of, like, even just in research results, the range is not like just, there can be so much being masked in an average, and having a sense of what those potential ranges are, then you get a good sense of what are my risks too. If I'm a farmer, am I looking at this, if the average yield loss is 17%, but my risk is 0 to 100, then they know, okay, well, this is something I've really got to watch, because if I don't, I risk potentially 0. So the ranges then give them a good sense of what level of risk are involved. If the range is really tight, then they go, okay, well, I may be safe in not, the risk isn't as much as if the range is so huge.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments. One more question that I see in our chat and question area. If there are other questions, please feel free to type them in for those of you on the line. I've got under questions, if grower adoption depends on economic analysis, should we assume that GFO's growers are only interested in their farm economics? Or should we assume that they are also interested in adopting practices that might break even on their own costs, but provide environmental benefit? It's a great question. I guess maybe both of us did answer that one. I may make a first comment on that one. And I think when you start quantifying benefits, and John mentioned that it's difficult to quantify some of these environmental benefits. But if there are things that can be quantified there, and especially if they're, some environmental benefits also still provide benefit back to a farmer. And, short-term costs are maybe what they are, it might break even. So break even is a pretty good starting point, actually, if there's break even and then environmental benefit on top. That's going to depend a little bit project to project. But I don't know if you'd like to take a stab at that, John, and make some more comment in terms of what you are aware of from grower adoption.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's sort of the government policy question, right? As far as, if we're looking to, if these are good practices that have societal benefits, are there then government policy, government programs that go in place. Like I know there's some availability of, say cover crops covered in the CAP program, right? So some of those things that can help offset some of the costs so that there's greater benefit, so that the benefits of a crop aren't, or the costs aren't solely borne by the farmer, where the society is benefiting as well. So that is a government policy question, and it's something that we're always looking at. And I'm not necessarily involved in sort of the program development, but it's certainly a question on those comes up. If there's greater public good, does it make sense to have government policies in place that try to increase adoption, that doesn't put all of the costs, that the farmer doesn't bear all the costs on that have benefits beyond the farm gate?
So John, I remember back in your cover crop example where you had all the details laid out. One scenario was if there was a government incentive, how would that change it? And I think when we start looking at environmental benefits, if that's the main benefit from a farmer's standpoint, there is a bit of a hurdle just to get over. Do I need to spend my time here to try and figure this out? And that's worth something to a farmer, and making sure that those sorts of things are factored into an analysis, or at least an assessment of whether this may be adopted, is important. Because if they simply see it as an environmental benefit that doesn't really affect their farm, are they going to jump into it and try to understand it and implement it? I think that there is clearly a barrier there a lot of times.
Yeah, for sure. I agree.
Okay, there's one more. Okay, I got another question. When we do a partial budget using data from multiple years, we should make an adjustment with net present value. Are there some guidelines on what net present value can be assumed for grain farmers?
Well, that's right. Like, are you thinking about like the interest rate that you're using within the net present value calculation? Is that what the question is? If that's the question, I don't know whether that one is the piece of it. But I mean, yeah, because in the net present value calculations, you're looking at what rate you use, and a common approach is using the return on a conservative investment like a GIC or that type of thing, but also a risk factor in there as well, sort of for a farmer to then think about what is a reasonable return that I'm looking for to calculate that net present value. There are some approaches similar to that, but yeah, I mean, it does depend a little bit on farmer expectations as far as returns and what they factor into the net present values. But yeah, there is a bit of work on what is the right interest rate or discount rate to use on that net present value for farms.
Okay. Are there any other questions on from participants? I don't see any currently. I think we're nearing the end of our time as well. So sounds good. Just to finish us off here, thank you all for attending. Thanks, John, for giving us some insight in this area and answering some questions. I want to encourage all of you, if you have some questions following this time, feel free to catch up with John, catch up with any one of us, and we'll try to steer you accordingly. This is an area that we're all kind of growing in together, understanding how we can work on this better. And I'd like to finish off with one more quick poll for those of you who are still on the line, just to understand how this webinar has gone. So I'm going to publish one more poll here. Should be up now under the polls area. And yeah, thank you very much, John. And all the best to all of you pulling together proposals right now.
Great, thanks, Joss.
Thank you very much.